This is the Voyage Report podcast, where you get the scoop on travel. Now, the editor-in-chief of the Voyage Report, Mark Albert.
Greetings, fellow travelers, and welcome. We're really glad you're with us. Today, we're going to talk about the current security and threat environment people should be aware of while traveling in 2017, both at home and abroad. Our guest is not only one of the hardest working and best sourced network correspondents I know, but also a friend who's really helped me in my journalism career. Jeff Pegues is the Justice and Homeland Security correspondent for CBS News, based in Washington, D.C. Jeff, thanks for being with us.
Oh, Mark, what a pleasure. How are you?
Doing great. Fantastic. Love to have you on. We know it's been a very busy time for you, obviously, keeping up with all the developments in the Trump administration. So thanks right away for breaking away and being with us. We start out every podcast asking our guests really the same three questions so that our listeners get a sense of who the person is and their travel habits. So let's start off, if we can, asking you, Jeff, what has been your biggest discovery while traveling? This could be a place, this could be a food, it could be something about yourself.
Well, what I've discovered is that I love room service. I'm addicted to room service, Mark. You know why? It's breakfast in bed every time you go on vacation. And that's frankly why I enjoy getting out of town, because you go to hotels and you can have someone deliver the food to your room.
You get pampered.
It's expensive. Don't get me wrong, and I don't recommend it for everyone, but it's just one of those things that I do for myself, and that's what I love about traveling.
You love to be pampered, and you're entitled to. That's fantastic. So what's the favorite place that you've been to? You not only travel, obviously, with family and friends, but, for work, you travel a lot as well. What's your favorite place?
Anywhere that is a resort and that has a golf course. That, for me, as an adult, and at this point in my life, that's kind of what I look for. I'm trying to go places where I get away and it feels like I'm in a type of paradise, and for me, paradise means being somewhere on a beautiful golf course, hacking it up.
Are you a good golfer, Jeff?
Oh, no.
Oh,
See,
okay.
I hope to be one day. But I am not a good golfer. I'm okay, but I'm not as good as I want to be. And that's one of those things where it's my hobby, so I'm trying to get better at it.
So Jordan Spieth and Tiger Woods and all of those, Mickelson, they don't have anything to worry about?
Oh, no, not at all. But gosh, what a life they have, I tell you.
Yeah.
If play golf for a living, that would be great.
So what's the next place you're traveling to?
I'm going to take my family to, guess what? A golf course.
Of course.
Essentially, Kiowa, South Carolina. That's where I'm going to go. They have some beautiful golf courses down there, and so we will spend some time down there. They can play in the pool, hang out at the beach, while I go and hit some balls on the fairways. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Awesome. So, no matter where you're traveling to, obviously people are watching the news and they're reading the newspaper and they're aware of events that are going on. And so, if they're traveling somewhere, Jeff, what should they be aware of this year? I mean, what is the security outlook really for travelers, both here and going overseas in 2017?
Given the landscape in terms of what is happening around the world right now, you really have to pay attention to where you're going, in my opinion. I will never try to talk someone out of taking a vacation, going someplace that might be a little off the beaten path. Keep in mind, I grew up, and Mark, I don't know if you know this, but I spent about the first 13 years of my life living in Africa. And
wow. No, I didn't.
In different countries around Africa. I was in Zimbabwe, Zaire, Nigeria, Ivory Coast. So all over the continent. And it was an incredible experience.
Were your parents in the military?
My father was a banker. And so we traveled around Africa a lot. I lived in Paris for a little while. We lived in the Philippines. So we traveled a great deal, and it was an incredible experience. And so I will never tell any traveler not to go someplace. What I will say is that it is important to know the political atmosphere where you're going, and make sure that if you're a U.S. traveler, certainly you follow the State Department warnings and travel alerts. That's very important. Make sure that you're aware of your surroundings if you are in a public place. And I think that's really important these days in Europe, some parts of Europe, certainly, but anywhere. I mean, in this day and age, it is important that you pay attention to what's going on around you. Make sure that that as an American, frankly, you're not standing out too much. But it is important that you also get out and experience things. That's part of traveling, and that's why we do it. And it is important to explore. I mean, that's what I'm all about as a journalist. That's part of the reason why I got into this business, to see things, to experience things, and that's what traveling is all about. You have to be careful doing it. That's important too.
And so listeners, Jeff was just mentioning about the State Department. And so if you go on to voyagereport.com and you go under tips and tricks, and under health and safety, we've got a whole page on staying safe while traveling, and specifically how to enroll in the State Department's STEP program, the Smart Travel Enrollment Program. Those security alerts are free. Just like Jeff mentioned, they can come into your email box, and they will give you the latest on what the political situation there is at your destination. So, Jeff, any major threats or concerns that you're hearing from Justice, Homeland, from your sources here and abroad? I mean, about, you said you would never encourage people to stay home, but any information from them about what people specifically should be alert for?
Well, yes, unfortunately, with this threat from terrorist organizations like ISIS, for example, what I hear when I talk to law enforcement and intelligence sources, and whether it's FBI Director James Comey or former CIA Director John Brennan, there is this concern across Europe about ISIS fighters from Syria and Iraq somehow making it into Europe and traveling back to Europe to carry out attacks. And so there is heightened concern about that right now. And some of the countries that you really have to be concerned about are France, Belgium, even Germany. So there is this concern in the intelligence community that there are fighters from these battlefields who are leaking back into Europe, trying to blend in, and then when the time is right, carrying out attacks. And what they look for, typically, based on what I'm learning from intelligence sources, what these ISIS attackers look for, they look for these popular landmarks, destinations where you'll find large gatherings. You really have to pay attention to your surroundings. Make sure that you're not alone. Make sure that you know what's going on around you for that reason. There have been attacks, as you know. There was the one in Nice where people were gathered for the fireworks. There was the truck attack in Germany as well. I don't want to dissuade people from taking their trips and living their lives, because you have to go about your business. You have to keep doing what you do and doing the things that you enjoy doing. But just always be alert.
Right, and isn't that the central challenge with terrorism, right? I mean, they want people to be terrorized and for you to, I suppose, huddle in your house and never go outside. And so, that's really obviously a great point to make. You mentioned Nice and the Germany attacks. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've seen sort of those attacks kind of influence what's happening here in the United States. I mean, didn't I see big dump trucks used? I think maybe you covered it or somebody at CBS, in the perimeter of the New Year's Eve celebration in Times Square. I think we saw them initially in front of Trump Tower right after the election. So I'm curious, Jeff, how have those attacks overseas that you mentioned changed security, do you think, here at home and how we travel domestically?
Well, that's one of the things that I admire about law enforcement and the intelligence community in this country is that when there are incidents overseas, they try to go, learn, collaborate with the officials there who are investigating, and then take the lessons learned from those incidents and bring them back home and incorporate it into law enforcement tactics here. And that's what we've seen. Whenever there's an attack overseas, they try to change tactics here to adjust. And yes, you're right. The Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade this past November, they bring out these big dump trucks because they want to prevent some attacker in a truck or something trying to bust through a barrier to get to the parade route. You don't want that to happen. So how do you do it? You counter a big truck with another big truck, and that's what they've done at many of these big events now. And yeah, that is a lesson learned from places like Nice. And there are other things that go into place in terms of security here in the U.S. when there are incidents overseas. Law enforcement is evolving, and that's what's remarkable. That after so many decades of police departments and law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies, day to day, they have to adjust based on the emerging threats. And that's what we see not only overseas, but also here at home. And that's why intelligence is so important in terms of the kind of information that you can gather to prevent an attack. That is so important. And that's why you see many in the intelligence community, frankly, working so hard to pick up signals, whether it's online signals or human signals of impending attacks.
It sounds like what you're saying is it's not just intelligence, but nimble intelligence, being nimble when you see something happen and really treating it as a case study, I suppose, right? To constantly learn and evaluate and change what you're doing.
Oh, that's right. You can never be too comfortable in law enforcement. That's what I hear over and over again. You have to be prepared to adjust your tactics based on the emerging threats. And we've seen that here in the U.S. quite a bit, especially since 9/11. So it is a requirement for effective law enforcement and intelligence to be able to adjust to the emerging threats. And we are seeing that nationwide.
With these emerging threats, do you think there's an increased risk to inside the U.S.? I mean, obviously, we're going to have July 4th coming up, Memorial Day, all of these things that happen every year. But do you think the risk has gone up in the U.S.?
I think so. In certain ways, yes. This idea of the homegrown violent extremist, someone who is sitting online and reading messages from ISIS and somehow becomes radicalized, that has developed the kind of phenomenon that is tough for law enforcement to stop because, in the past, you would kind of know where the threats were coming from because these were people who had a criminal past. They were on law enforcement's radar. Now you have someone sitting in a home, doesn't socialize much, on the computer quite a bit, reading these toxic messages from groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, and then being motivated to act. And you don't know when that trigger is going to happen. It could be anything. It could be something they see on the news. It could be something they see in a movie. And it just triggers action. And so it is hard for law enforcement these days to spot some of these threats. And again, that's why intelligence is so important, making sure that you're seeing all the signs that are out there, not only in the cyber sphere, but in other areas as well. And so are we less safe these days? I don't know. I get asked that question quite a bit. What I know is that sometimes these days it's harder to spot the threats before the attacks happen.
Well, sure. We hear so much about the value of tips, and at a previous station I used to cover cops, and they would always talk about the value of tips. But it's hard to get a tip, right? When the person is sitting in their basement and they don't talk to anybody and they don't engage with anybody, and they're just sort of in their own head, there really are no tips to get.
Well, and the FBI director, James Comey, has said this over and over again, oftentimes with the link that they've seen in many of these terrorism cases, that they know that someone sees something happening in the person who turns into the suspect. There can be triggers in people, some sort of change in their life, change in their work situation, something that happens that just triggers them. And there are people around them who may notice these changes, but then don't say anything. And that's how you get to, well, if you see something,
Right.
say something.
That famous saying we're seeing everywhere now. So would your advice then not to avoid overseas travel, would that apply to the U.S. here, not to avoid big holiday events or whatnot?
Yeah. Meaning, and what I mean by that is go.
Right. Right.
I'm going to take my family to these big events. I am going to travel because I think it's important that we continue to do what we do as Americans. But again, just be informed. Stay up to date on the news. Make sure you know what the potential threats are. I mean, I'm head of a household with my wife, and so I want to make sure that my family is prepared for whatever may happen. I'm not going to scare my kids, but I'm going to be prepared. I know my wife is going to be prepared.
Right.
And that is our responsibility as adults and parents and responsible citizens, frankly.
Right.
And report something when you see something. That's an obligation I think we all have.
Well, it's important to point out that during the inauguration and the day after the Women's March, there were no attacks. Obviously we had some protests, but there were no terrorist attacks. And law enforcement has had a great record of trying to stop these things and stopping them and finding them before they occur, and has had some great successes.
No, they have. They have. And, in part because of improvements in technology, adjustments that law enforcement and the intelligence community has made based on the threats that they've seen overseas and based on incidents that have happened here. Maybe certainly not the scale of what happened on 9/11, but smaller incidents. You learn and you adjust, as I said earlier, and that's what they have done here. And that's why law enforcement in this country has been able to see some success in thwarting some potentially terrible incidents. But you can never be complacent. Law enforcement is not going to, they're not going to check off wins and losses because, the chances are pretty good that the next incident could be a loss for them. And so you just always have to be on your toes.
Well, and they're fond of saying that, the terrorist only has to be right one time and we have to be right 100% of the time. The Global Business Travel Association recently reported a so-called Trump slump to U.S. tourism. And they reported that there was a $185 million loss in business travel bookings following President Trump's executive order implementing that travel ban we've all heard so much about and which CBS has reported very thoroughly about. And it's now ultimately been suspended by the courts. So, Jeff, I'm curious, what if someone living overseas, a citizen of a country other than the U.S., is looking to travel to America? What can they expect now? You've covered the upheaval and all the confusion, and it's unfolding every single day, it looks like, on this travel ban. What can they expect, foreign tourists coming to the U.S.?
Well, right now, certainly there is some confusion about where the president's immigration ban goes next. We have been told by the White House and the Justice Department they will essentially start from scratch and try and go at it again. But for now, things are as they were when President Obama was in office. In other words, there's no ban from those 7 countries that President Trump had mentioned in his executive order. And so if you're traveling from overseas coming here to the U.S., it is business as usual. You have to go through the same type of protocols that you did during the Obama administration. However, going forward, you should pay attention to the news and what's going on with the immigration ban. Because it is sort of in flux right now, that policy, and we'll have to see where it goes in court. It can be confusing. I mean, there's a lot of legal stuff going on that you really have to pay attention to, but the bottom line is things are where they were when President Obama was in office.
for many people, traveling on an overseas trip, I don't care where you're going, is sort of a huge deal, right? I mean, you spend money and you've spent time researching it and all of this stuff, and you may have needed a visa to go here. And so it's hard to tell people to travel and for tourism when there is this uncertainty at the moment. How do you plan an international trip that you've been looking forward to for maybe a year or so when you don't really know if the door is going to be open or the door is going to be closed when you get there?
Well, you're right. And, and we've talked about this, Mark. You're more of an expert at traveling overseas than I am. Sometimes I don't know how you do it so effortlessly. But, obviously we can all learn lessons from you and your experiences. But for me, I have, two relatively young kids. I have a 7-year-old and a 15-year-old. And so when we travel, I think about them and their needs. And we are getting to the point where we are going to travel overseas more as a family. And so, I will be reaching out to you, Frank, Mark, to
VoyageReport.com, Jeff.
Yes. I'm into this because I know that it will help me down the road with my family.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you very much. So, when Americans come back overseas, and this happens to me every time, that I come in, and, you go through customs and immigration, and everybody coming into the U.S. does this, and you answer the questions from the immigration and the customs agent there. And, I think a lot of people are surprised to learn that there are these little known rules about what Customs and Border Protection authorities can search, can seize at the border. So if I'm carrying a cell phone and a laptop or an iPad or, all these electronics we all carry with us these days, Jeff, what should I know? If I'm coming back to the border, do I have any expectation of privacy? Can they search my cell phone? I mean, I get this question a lot from people.
No, if they ask to search your cell phone, you have to allow them to do it. Otherwise, they won't allow you on that flight or your computer. So they can conduct a brief inspection of your electronic device. So that is just something that you have to keep in mind. If you're traveling, that, post 9/11, which is amazing how long it's been now, because it seems like yesterday.
It does, yeah.
But so much has changed around the world. And, certainly with traveling through airports, I remember the days when you just walked up to the gate. And it's really incredible how things have evolved since then. And so now you really have to be prepared for searches that some people may view as invasive, but law enforcement views it as a necessary thing for them to do. And so if they ask you to show them your device or can I see this bag or what's in this bag, you have to allow them to do it, or they won't allow you on the flight.
Right, and coming back into the U.S. as well, not just airports, but land borders, cruises, etc. I mean, they've got the same authority. They can search your electronics, and they don't need a warrant, right?
That is right. They don't need a warrant. You have to give up some expectations of privacy if you're traveling in these public places or through these public places these days. And that's just part of it. They are trying to ensure the safety of tens of millions of travelers across the globe. And U.S. law enforcement and Department of Homeland Security specifically has had an impact on airports across the globe, and often has a say in what policies airports across the globe have in terms of airport security because of the U.S. airlines flying out of those airports. And so there is a great deal of cooperation between different countries these days when it comes to airports, because it's all so interconnected. And that's why you see these standards of security, and anything less than this standard these days, it's frowned upon. And there is an effort to step up security as much as you can. And so if you're traveling through an airport and you don't want someone seeing what's in your bag, well, forget about it, because look, if they have any reason to suspect wrongdoing.
And listeners, I think also a good rule of thumb is that if you have the only copy of your work presentation that's due on Monday on that phone or that laptop, you never know whether that's going to be seized or detained or whatnot. So I would certainly make a backup or carry a different device. But Jeff, you're talking about these changes to airports, and I just came back from Greece, and if I connect through Amsterdam too, you really see it in the airports there. If you go to any flights going to the U.S., in a lot of cases they do have these secondary screenings at the gate. So you've gone through security already to get into the airport, and you look at all the different gates and all the different destinations around the world, and it's the ones going to the U.S. that have the secondary searches, the tables there at the gate where they can pull your bag over and look at you. So, I think if somebody flashed forward from the past 20 years ago and they walked into an airport today, it'd be vastly different.
Well, yeah, and it is, and that's based on the threats that are emerging and the threats that we've already seen, unfortunately. But you're right. I when that started happening, when they had that secondary screening as you're getting on the plane, it sort of really opened my eyes to not only some of the evolving threats, but how law enforcement is reacting to it. And if you're doing it at the gate, what's next? Are you going to start searching people on the planes? So where does it stop? That's another question that some people might ask.
Right.
What is the next step? But you really have to adjust, and you have to see what the public is willing to live with. And when they see what's happening across the globe, they become more comfortable with the added security. Because they know, well, they want to get to their destination. And law enforcement is trying to ensure that that happens. And that's why you see all these searches, all these layers of security, because by the time you go through the first level of screening, there's a lot that can happen between that point and the next level of screening, and law enforcement knows this, and that's why they're trying to cut down on the number of opportunities for people to pick up some sort of object that could cause problems, but also prevent people from getting on planes who shouldn't be on planes.
So, Jeff, if I'm reading between the lines, I think what you're saying is we're going to have to keep taking our shoes off and our jackets off and only little bottles of liquids for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, that's the way of life. And, it's getting better, though. I know you travel a lot. I travel a lot for work. And with TSA pre-check, I enjoy that, not having to take off my shoes and empty my bags and take off my coat. I love that.
Well, you need to try Clear, and full disclosure, listeners, I'm a member of Clear. I get it free through Delta as a SkyMiles elite member there. But, it's now in, I think, 20 airports or something, and it's this biometric thing at the airports. One of the main criticisms against it is that it just isn't very broad-based. I mean, it hasn't been in very many airports. But Delta has taken a small ownership stake. They're expanding it. So basically what you do is you give them an iris scan, you do your fingerprints, and then you no longer have to show your boarding pass at the TSA checkpoint. You go to a Clear kiosk, you scan your pass, you put your fingerprints there, and then they whisk you to the front, Jeff, the front of TSA pre-check. So you may look into that. It's at the DCA airport now.
Oh, okay. Clear.
Clear, yep. Clear, I think it's Clear Me is the website, but it's this biometric security, and if you apply to it, they will whisk you to the front of the line. And for listeners, we do have a free 3-month pass on voyagereport.com that you can sign up and use. So Jeff, you mentioned that you encourage people not to change their plans. Can I assume that you're not changing any travel plans? You mentioned you're going to be traveling more with your family. I mean, you want them to experience the world, don't you?
I do. I do want them to experience the world, but we're going to do it at our own pace. We're going to go places where we know we will be safe. But it is important to experience all that this world has to offer, and that's what I grew up doing, having lived overseas, and that's what I plan to instill in my kids, that you should see the world. You should go to those places so you can get that diversity of opinion. which I think is so important. So yeah, we're going to travel, and we're going to go to some pretty incredible places.
So before we leave the airports, I did want to ask you, you've reported for CBS that the TSA has been blasted for this insider threat security gap, I think it's called, after you obtained some cell phone video showing airport workers swiping a key card and then just waltzing on through a secure area with nobody checked their identity or their bags or anything like that. The Associated Press has reported airport fence jumpers happen a lot more frequently than we think. I think they boiled it down for 1 year that it was happening once every 10 days, which is pretty alarming. I mean, I've got to go through all the security and somebody can just hop over the fence, and lawmakers have warned about this so-called insider threat. So what's being done about this?
In the eyes of some, not enough. I mean, this is a recurring theme that we've heard for several years now, that not enough attention has been paid to the folks who are working around the planes, working with the concessions, working delivering food and putting on the planes. There is a concern about a lack of screening and attention paid to folks who are not going through the type of screening that the passengers go through. And so this is something that, you're right, people on Capitol Hill have tried to draw attention to. I know several people who have worked in very important positions for the Department of Homeland Security and TSA who've talked about this quite a bit. And they feel like this is the type of gap in security that really has to be addressed. In fact, there was a case of someone being able to smuggle guns on a plane, and they were eventually flown to the New York area and then picked up in New York. And this was a commercial plane, and it was a guns operation. I mean, really incredible stories of people who've been able to breach security because they worked in the airports. And that's not, painting all airport employees as people who are out to do something wrong. It's just there are those who feel like that is a gap in the system that could be exploited by terrorist organizations or criminals. And that's why you have to ensure, according to the folks who are concerned about this, that you make sure that these employees are screened as thoroughly as passengers are, because we have done stories where people are being, the person in front of them scans their card, gets through the gate, and then somebody just walks through with them. And it's allowed to happen over and over and over again. And then the bags that they're bringing into the airport are not screened. Like the bags that passengers are bringing in to the airport, they are screened. And so there are gaps there that people think should be plugged. And this insider threat is one of the issues that seems to come up over and over again, and yet it's not addressed in the way that many people want to see it addressed.
Well, we know that if they do address it again, you're going to be all over it reporting it for CBS News. Jeff Pegues, Justice and Homeland Security Correspondent at CBS News, and an all-around great guy. And Jeff, thanks so much for all of your insight.
Thank you, buddy.
You can follow Jeff on Twitter at Jeff Pegues CBS. That's JEFFPEGUES CBS. Listeners, what did you learn from Jeff's podcast here about the security changes? Are they going to affect how you travel or where you're planning to travel this year? Let us know by rating this podcast, giving us a review, and sharing it on social media. We'll have guests every week talking about travel news and trends, so be sure to subscribe to our podcast. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Mark Albert. Bon voyage.
You've been listening to the Voyage Report podcast. Get the scoop on travel at voyagereport.com.